Hi folks, welcome to RJA Impact. Today we're going to be going through the closing arguments in the Paul Flores, Ruben Flores, Kristin Smart case. As a reminder, Paul is on trial charged with the murder of Kristin Smart, and his father Ruben is on trial with the connection of helping cover up the crime. We had the last witness testimony last week, and on October the 3rd, Monday, we had the closing arguments begin. And it started with Judge O'Keefe talking to the jurors about the laws that apply to the charges. Just before we get into that, it's probably worth pointing out that apparently the entire left side of the room is filled with Smart family members and supporters, along with various members of the District Attorney's Office and the Sheriff's Office. On the right-hand side of the courtroom, we just have Ruben and Susan Flores with their own attorneys. So the first thing that the judge points out to the jury is that the defendant is being prosecuted for murder under multiple theories, and they don't all need to agree on the same theory, only that individually the defendant committed a murder, and then together find that that is the case. She pointed out that to find Paul guilty of felony murder, they must also find that he committed or attempted to commit a rape in the process, and that the person, or the death of a person, resulted due to that intent. The offences that the jury therefore need to consider are that it could be premeditated first-degree murder, felony murder in the commission of an attempted rape, second-degree murder, or an acquittal. Now, if you remember, we had two women in court that testified that Paul R.'d them. Well, in their case, the jury must decide if he did actually R them before they can consider, i.e. the jury can consider their testimony as evidence. And despite those findings, these are actually uncharged crimes. Now, Paul Flores didn't testify in his own self-defence, and O'Keefe pointed out to the jury the following: do not consider for any reason at all that the defendant did not testify. Do not discuss that in your deliberation. And finally, you must decide what the facts are. It's up to you and you alone. So the way the closing arguments work is that first we have the prosecution, then we have the defence, and then we have a final rebuttal by the prosecution. So first of all, we had Deputy DA Pouvrel take the stand and address the jury. He does go on to recap all the evidence, and we'll touch on some of that, but I thought some of the appeal to the jury was quite interesting. In quotes, "It's been a long trial. It's been 11 Sundays since I've given my opening statement. It's been 1,370 Sundays since Stan and Denise Smart waited for that phone call, the phone call that would never come." And then turning and pointing out to Ruben and Susan Flores, who are obviously in the audience, he says, "But you know where she was all along." And then turning back to the jury, she was under their deck. Quite a powerful way of approaching the opening arguments, I think. The SLO community moved heaven and earth to search for Kristin Smart. The Flores family moved the dirt under their deck, twice. They treated Kristin's burial with less reverence than the family dog. The truth is, Kristin Smart is dead. She was plucked off the face of the earth by Paul Flores. He points out that there were no cameras in Paul Flores' dorm back in 1996, obviously, and there was no cameras when Sarah Doe and Rhonda Doe alleged that they were R'd in Paul's house. And for crimes that happen in a bedroom, there are no witnesses. But ground-penetrating radar, a forensic archaeologist, and a lab supervisor tell us what Kristin could not. But we have her blood, a couple of grains of bloody sand. That's all the Smart family has left of their daughter. Pouvrel points out that the jury can make a verdict without having a body as evidence. He's as guilty as sin, he says many times, pointing at Flores every time he says it. We then get into some of the detail that was produced during witness testimony. It spoke about the fact that Flores would hang around Kristin's dorm, stare at her, seek her out, try to interact with her, etc. We heard about the one witness that says he saw Paul Flores in Kristin's dorm at least once, and that she looked uncomfortable at the time. Using one of the witness's words, Pouvrel says, Paul Flores saw her as a bitch dick tease. and at this point the jurors all turn around to look at Paul. We heard about the party on the fateful night when Kristin disappeared, and Poverall says that Paul Flores forced himself on her, i.e. Kristin, while trying to separate her from a group of friends. Do you see a pattern, he says, that tells you about his mindset that night, that he was going to do whatever he can to hunt her that night? We heard about Kristin's interactions with people at the party and the fact that they testified that she didn't smell of alcohol, yet 90 minutes later she was found passed out on the garden next door and too intoxicated to consent to intercourse. I'm trying to be sparing with the words people are using just to be on the safe side of YouTube's algorithms, so you'll have to read between the lines on a couple of those comments when I make them. Tim and Cheryl testified that Paul inserted himself into the entourage walking Smart home, and Paul Flores had promised to Cheryl that he would get Smart home safely, a promise that he breaks, Poverall said. We heard about Paul's best friend when he saw the bruise under Paul's eye. What did Paul Flores tell him? He just woke up with it. Well, there's no reason to lie to your best friend. Paul himself admits that the story he told investigators was a lie, a little white lie, a fib. Now, if you're willing to lie about that during a homicide investigation, what else would you lie about? Poverall says. We heard about the investigators, in particular Detective Kennedy, when he arrives at Paul's dorm and noted that Paul's heart was beating out of his chest. Why was he nervous? Because days before, Kristin Smart's lifeless body laid on his mattress, he says. We heard about Jennifer. If you remember, she was the witness that told her roommate Justin what Paul had said to her. In other words, a confession, and her boyfriend corroborated everything that she'd said. About the keeping of Kristin's remains under the deck, he mentions Ruben Flores and says, Ruben Flores has made a multi-decade effort to guard his yard. He doesn't want Stan Smart anywhere near his deck. When Angie goes to visit, Ruben and Paul redirected her away from the deck. He wouldn't even let a plumber go under the deck. The ground-penetrating radar found an anomaly under the deck, 6 feet by 4 feet, large enough to contain a human body. And the area just happened to contain staining consistent with a human burial site. The blood test that Angie Butler used to check the soil, HemDirect, she'd used it over 1,000 times. It's either blood or not. It's a binary test, Poverall says. Red and black fibres found in the sticky parts of the soil. And what was Kristin last seen wearing? Red tennis shoes and black shorts. Facebringer said that she could do a fibre comparison. Poverall makes the point, but we can't do a comparison because they're still holding on to the body. And again he points at Ruben and Susan Flores in the audience. We're required to prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt, but not beyond all doubt. Everything in life is subject to some doubt, but what is the defence arguing is reasonable. 19-year-olds do not spontaneously die and hide their own bodies. He talks about Paul and somewhat his nature, and he talks about the other two R's that were committed and testified to in court by Paul. If you believe either one, i.e. either one witness, it shows that he was inclined to commit R. You are allowed to consider this for the limited purpose of deciding whether Paul acted with intent to commit an R in this case. Paul Flores had a common plan or scheme to rape intoxicated women by separating them from others who could help them and returning to his residence with them, he says. His final comment, I ask you to render a truthful verdict that Paul Flores is guilty of the murder. And with that he sat down, and then we had the defence attorney Robert Sanger for Paul. Oh dear. Judge O'Keefe asks, Mr. Sanger, are you prepared to begin your closing? And in a bit of a fluster, Robert Sanger for the defence says, I didn't realise he was going to be that quick, and then laughs and says, just let me start up my computer. So he tries to start his closing arguments while his computer, etc., is booting up, and he says, the evidence does not show a murder was committed, and the prosecution case is a bunch of conspiracy theories not backed by facts. And then says, I'm not ready with a PowerPoint yet. Clearly his computer's still booting up. Whilst he struggles with the computer, he makes a couple of comments saying, Peveril is grasping at straws and trying to bootstrap a murder, and that there is no evidence of a murder, nor any evidence of a rape, both of which Paul is accused of. He says that the prosecution's case is largely based on Jennifer Hudson, who had the alleged confession made to her, and he calls her bizarre and not credible, and the fact that she's been inconsistent with her statements, and he called her testimony preposterous. Paul never said that vile language about Smart. He never confessed to the murder. It's a vile thing to say, and evokes passion that causes you to not like Paul Flores. He points out that she was a drug user, ex-motorcycle gang member, and tries to denigrate her to the jury. He attacks to some extent the various publicity in the case and talk about people who inserted themselves into the case. In particular, he singles out Chris Lambert, who's the author of Your Own Backyard podcast. Good grief, Sanger is still not done with his computer. Your Honour, can we take about 2 minutes? I have it all plugged in, but I don't know what's going to happen when I push the button. And the jurors are sent into the hallway whilst he hooks up his computer, and that takes about 9 minutes. Good grief. So the jurors come back into the courtroom and Sanger starts to talk about his PowerPoint presentation. Oh dear, he's forgotten to switch his microphone on. And he says, and I'll read this verbatim, "There we go. What I was saying was Mr. Peveril likes to put a big San Luis Obispo District Attorney seal up at the beginning of his PowerPoint. So I put a big SS&D, which is Sanger, Swisson and Dunkel, logo on top of mine. Either way, that's not evidence of anything." My word, I'm not sure about you, but I don't think that's the way to start a serious defence of a client that's going to go to jail potentially for the rest of his life. When he does eventually start talking seriously to the jury, he goes on to say that a defendant is presumed innocent unless the evidence proves he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and he emphasised that the entire prosecution case is circumstantial. So, it turns out, and I'm not making this up, a defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. He denigrates Kristin Smart, saying that she was engaged in risky behaviour during her time at Cal Poly, including the night of her disappearance. There is no evidence of a murder, he says. Conspiracy theories are fun, but you're here as jurors. A defendant is presumed to be innocent. And on Kristin, all these kids were college kids drinking at a party. She was kissing a number of different guys and falling down and getting drunk. It would be nice to say she was angelic, but the reality was that she was engaged in risky behaviour. You can't say, oh, I hate Paul Flores after all the things that Mr. Peveril said, and you can't say, I feel bad for the Smart family, which I think we all do, but you can't say you're going to convict him because of that. On the dogs, we had dogs alerting all over the place. They alerted at the Performing Arts Centre, at an administrative building. Peveril objects that this misstates the evidence, but is overruled. If these dogs had alerted up on a hill somewhere and some student had been seen up on that hill, Mr. Peveril would be asking you to find that student guilty and ignore all the other alerts, Sanger says. He rips into the credentials of the dog handlers and says that they shouldn't be considered expert witnesses. Junk science is what he calls it. He hits at the publicity that the case has had over all of the years and said that some witnesses like Rhonda Doe, who accused Paul of R-ing her, only came forward after the publicity, and that the publicity in general has influenced witness testimony in one way or another. Sanger goes on to pick apart and create doubt on each of the individual witnesses' testimony. So with Jennifer, who apparently heard the confession, she says she's colourblind, but then she says the truck was either blue or green. Steve, who was running by Kristin Smart's dorm room on his way to practice, whilst he's running, is still able to say Kristin Smart was uncomfortable and Paul is a nasty person and all that, as he says. Cindy Arrington was very teacher-like when she testified, but then she couldn't answer questions on cross-exams. Rhonda Doe was a weird one. 25 years later, she says, I saw Paul Flores at this bar and I don't know what happened and I was raped. Then it came up under cross-examination that she'd lived in Arroyo Grande when all this publicity was going on. So many of these people who testified, so many of them were associated with the website Son of Susan, or they've talked to the podcaster Chris Lambert. He's got nothing to do with this case. He was something like 7 years old when it happened, and he's just come up with all of these so-called conspiracy theories. And then on to Paul, about the black eye, which he has to address at some point. Sanger says, "Then you heard all about the supposed lies about his black eye. When young people get a black eye, what do they say? Oh, I don't know. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. He was very straightforward about everything else. Even if these things make you wonder, Mr. Pooverall wants to make you wonder. It's not proof of a murder," he says. The dog handlers, they use a lot of lingo like in odour. What's in odour? That's the imagination of the dog handler. Now, I don't want to disparage these people because they're volunteers, but they get certified by their own private group, which is one of many groups all over the country. Adela Morris started a new group, which I think she uses to make profits. We broke for the day there, and when the court was reassembled in the morning, Sanger says that we had a juror question yesterday. I don't think we've ever gotten a juror question during closing arguments before, but that's okay. One of you asked about the testimony of the dog handler, Adela Morris. I had said in my argument that she said dogs would alert on vomit, and the juror wanted to know, is that right? Did she say that? And he says to them, that's your job to go through the testimony and figure things out. The prosecution knew Paul Flores went to his room and threw up a little bit, and they had a dog handler testify to things. Now, we know that there are false alerts. They're reluctant to agree, but we've seen the false alerts in this case. About the Sarah Doe and Rhonda Doe witnesses who testified about being AR'd, he points out that these are uncharged crimes. About the sex toy, it's not a crime to own a sex toy. This is about the ball gag. Why is this detail relevant to the trial, Sanger asks. He points out some inconsistencies in their statements, like describing Paul Flores' house as being near railroad tracks where they're actually a couple of blocks away. The fact that they could have been influenced by all the publicity to come forward many, many years later to talk about their ordeals. At least one witness had posted on the Justice for Kristin Smart page, which was dedicated to convicting Paul Flores. Another witness was interviewed by FBI at the time, 1996, but didn't mention Paul Flores by name until about 2 decades later. Sanger says, I'm not saying anyone's getting up here and lying. They may believe what they said. We just don't know. On the night of the party, Sanger goes on to denigrate Kristin again. I'm not here to embarrass Kristin Smart or be unkind to her family or anything else, he says. That's not my job, but it was the prosecution who brought these witnesses out, which they did. We noted she went to the party that night because people saw her there. She was tall, dressed in a way that people would remember her. She was kissing guys, doing some things. She went into the bathroom with Ted Bolter, etc., etc. We heard about the detectives that reviewed the case, in particular Mike Kennedy, who said that they were going to look at a bunch of different things, but then in his notes it says that they decided to focus on Paul Flores, so that happened. And he noted that Paul Flores' story never changed throughout the investigation into Smart's disappearance and beyond the question of how he got the black eye, that is. About Kristin herself, he says she could have gone off and decided she wanted a different life. There are those cases where that happened. It's sad that Kristin Smart disappeared, and she may have gone out on her own, but who knows, Sanger says. It's sad. Something happened to her. It's unfortunate. But what was it? He has a go at one of the forensic specialists that did the blood tests surrounding the digs, Angela Butler, and says she had no real knowledge of the HemDirect test except what she got from the brochure, and she followed the instructions. The HemDirect test doesn't mean anything. We've got a lot of junk science coming into the courtroom, Sanger says. At the end of his closing arguments, he says, now I'm going to sit down and Mr. Pooverall will have an opportunity to make a rebuttal, to rebut the things I've just said, not to argue his case again and not to appeal to emotions. I'm going to count on all the jurors to remember the actual law. The prosecution has the burden of overcoming this presumption of innocence. I want to thank you sincerely for your attention. I submit to you that the only proper verdict is not guilty. We then had the rebuttal from Deputy District Attorney Poverel again, and I'll just pick out the highlights here. A nice response to the point that Sangha was making on the risky behaviour Kristin Smart participated in. He says that the only risky behaviour she participated in was living in the same zip code as Paul Flores. Paul still doesn't have an alibi for the Saturday morning because, in quotes, he was murdering Kristin Smart and hiding the body with his dad. Pointing out the conspiracy theory argument by Sangha, would you believe that 50 witnesses are involved in a grand conspiracy? 6 cadaver dogs and the handlers are in on it. Even the media is in on it too. That's absurd, he says. He really took issue with Sangha saying that conspiracy theories are fun in his closing arguments. Did it look like the woman with the ball gag was having fun, he asks. Did it look like Sarah Doe was having fun? Did it look like Rhonda Doe was having fun? This case is not fun, and the jurors have seen things that no human being should see. On the claim that the 6-foot by 4-foot soil anomaly under Ruben Flores' deck could have come from an avocado tree, he says that the whole area was full of avocado trees, and if this was true, then the entire property would look like a cemetery. He wraps up by reiterating his request for the jury to find Paul Flores guilty of first-degree murder and summarise the evidence presented in the case. If that's not enough, then what you seek is perfection, which does not exist, he says. And his final sentence, sometimes we tell our kids monsters do not exist, and that's not true. We've seen one in this trial. So after this, Sangha then moved for a mistrial, and apparently this is the 8th time he's done this, and he alleges in this case Poverel engaged in prosecutorial misconduct again. Poverel responded saying this is the 8th frivolous and groundless motion for a mistrial, and the motion was denied. So at about 3 o'clock on Tuesday the 4th of October 2022, the jury began deliberating the case. We have instructions and closing arguments for Ruben's jury as well, and I'll cover that in a different video. I hope you found that informative. If you want to hear about Ruben's closing arguments and the jury verdicts when they do come in, then please think about subscribing. It is appreciated. And I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.